Hi guys, I'm Dr. Sarah Jandricic, the Greenhouse Floriculture IPM Specialist for OMAFA. And today we're going to walk you through our microscope buying guide that we made as part of our Thrips identification workshop. And the idea of this is to help you pick a microscope that you can use not only to ID thrips, which can be pretty difficult to ID, but also use the microscope for things like quality assurance of natural enemies or looking at other pests under the microscope. You can also do some super fun things like taking photos and videos through the eyepieces of the microscope to get good quality photos for things like social media, or sending photos to your local extension agent that are actually clear enough that I can ID things. So we're going to walk you through some of the different types of microscopes today. And basically this video is for anyone who might be purchasing or using the microscope. So a grower, an IPM specialist, somebody working for a biocontrol company, really anyone that wants to up their insect identification game in the greenhouse world. Step one in our buying guide is deciding which kind of microscope you want. And there are several types. The two main types you will sort of encounter in the world of science microscopes are a compound scope and a dissecting scope, also known as a stereo microscope. So in general, you don't want to go with a compound scope. That's because their magnification is much higher. They go from anywhere from a 40 times magnification to a 2000 magnification. And generally you don't need that except for really detailed thrips identification where you're looking at really small features. So that's something we use in the lab, but that's not something as a grower or IPM specialist you're going to encounter very often. So you can recognize a compound microscope, obviously by its name online, but it'll also have some features that you may be able to pick out. So it'll have this like raised stage, and it will also have multiple focal lenses or magnification lenses that will turn on a dial. The other reason you wouldn't necessarily want to get a compound microscope to even look at something like thrips is that you would have to slide mount your thrips babies in order to ID them. Because basically this requires a very flat, almost two-dimensional surface to get really close to the slide-mounted thrips with these high magnification lenses. So instead, what you're looking for is a dissecting or stereo microscope. So one of the ways you'll be able to tell a dissecting scope as opposed to a compound scope is a couple of different features. First of all, you'll have a lot more room between the stage down here and the focal point of the microscope or the body of the microscope. And you'll have these big dials here that let you move the body of the microscope up and down to be closer or further to the stage. And basically, the idea of that is to be able to accommodate bigger samples on the stage. So I often look at, whole leaves or parts of plants with multiple structures. And by changing the magnification and moving the body of the microscope closer or farther from the stage and where the specimen is, then I can focus on different parts of the leaf that I'm looking at, for example. So there are a lot of different dissecting scopes on the market you can find online. And we're going to just walk you through sort of highest cost to lowest cost in terms of some of their features and things you might want to look for. So this microscope that we use in the lab is a couple $1,000s. Generally, we find it a bit more of a sturdier build. And sometimes the ocular lenses can be a little bit crisper in terms of what you're looking at and the field of vision. Then we sort of have another big guy that's still pretty sturdy. And this one's about $400 or $500. And this little baby guy, we find totally serviceable for things like workshops and in the field. And I've had a couple growers buy this kind already. It's about $200 to $300. So the main disadvantage of this little guy is obviously the stage you have to work with for your specimens is a lot smaller. So if you are planning on looking at more whole plants or things like, I don't know, more like sticks or like branches or anything like that, then you might want a bigger stage. This would be for more, individual leaves or petri dishes full of insects. And then I would say the other main disadvantage of this, as me being a rather tall person, is for me to use this properly and feel more ergonomic and not have to like hunch over it. I usually have to raise this up on some books to make sure that the eyepieces, I'm not straining my neck to look through it. And then that makes like the stage surface at a little bit of an awkward height for me, whereas this one's a little better. And then I've had growers also mention during our workshops that because just everything's smaller, microscope, everything's smaller, just like little knobs, this can be difficult to work with if you do have large meat hands, as one of the growers put it to me. So it all just comes down to preference and how easily annoyed you are by things. So that's why I would probably recommend this in terms of both cost and being less annoying. So another feature between these two microscopes that might really affect your user experience and how much you like the microscope is something we call continuous zoom. So this more expensive one has continuous zoom. And what that means is between the lowest setting, which is 7 times magnification, to the highest setting, which is 45 times magnification, if you turn these dials gradually, you're able to see the whole magnification range between the 7 and the 45. And that's really good if you have different size bugs. If you're looking at something, big, like a ladybug, you're going to want to be more, closer to that 7. And then if you're looking at a thrips, you're going to want to be all the way to the 45. Something like this microscope, though, really only has 2 magnification settings on it. So it's got a 20 times magnification and a 40 times, and they just snap into place. So you're not able to get that, range between the 20 and the 40. So 30 might be your perfect magnification range for whatever you're looking at. So that can be kind of frustrating. The other thing is when you've got a specimen positioned at 20 and then you snap it to 40, because that is such a large jump in magnification, sometimes you can lose where your specimen is in front of you on the leaf when you're just looking through the eyepieces, because your focal point that you're looking at is much smaller than, if I'm just staring at this leaf without the microscope. So then you can spend some time being like, where'd it go? So just overall, this can be a less frustrating type of magnification zoom. So the next feature we're going to talk about in terms of user experience and what you should pick is light source. There's pros and cons for sort of the cheaper microscope and the more expensive one. We've gotten rid of our very expensive lab microscope because we know you're probably not going to buy that. So this one from Amscope that we've been using for a lot of our workshops, the light source is built in. And the other benefit of this is it's actually rechargeable. So we plug this in before, and now we can use it without a cord getting in our way. So this might be advantageous to you if you're planning on bringing it to different greenhouses. Say if you're, bio company rep or consultant, there may be a benefit to you not having to have it plugged in all the time. I would say this light is adequate, but it's not super bright. I like a really bright field of view, but maybe that's just me because I'm kind of blind. So that's one option. So this middle of the road option, so it doesn't come with its own light source, you might have noticed. So you can buy external light sources. And this does add to the cost of the microscope, but these aren't going to, break the bank. So the first and cheapest option is what's called a ring light. And so this actually attaches to the body of the microscope with little screws. And so just be patient with me for a second. Okay, that's on enough. And so then it's got an on and off button, and then you can decrease or increase the brightness, and it gives you a really nice light field to work with. The other option is, which is more expensive, this can be anywhere from around, we looked it up online, like $130 to like $400, is a gooseneck light source. So these can fit sort of behind your microscope, and you can point them in different directions or just use one. So this can be handy if you're looking at sort of like shinier things. Like we find it helpful for sticky cards that we've wrapped in saran wrap that we want to look at thrips species afterwards. If you use this ring light that shines directly on it, it can be sort of like too reflective and it's too hard to see what's going on. But if you come at the light from the sides, you get enough light to see what you're doing, but it's not like shining straight back into the microscope. So I think overall, I prefer the gooseneck ones. In our lab, we do have a ring light where you can control which quadrant of the ring light is on, and that helps decrease the glare. So there's lots of options out there. Just make sure when you're buying the microscope to understand whether or not it has a light source included, and if that's another expense you're going to need, and what's compatible with it and what's not. So the last feature we're probably going to talk about today that can sort of make or break your microscope use is the eyepieces or ocular lenses of the microscopes. So one of my pet peeves in the microscope world is when the eyepieces are facing away from the stage, which means when you're using it, where you're looking and where you're using your hands are sort of out of line. And I find it just very unnatural for me to use. So there are some microscopes that come in that orientation, but there are lots of microscopes where you can change the orientation. So this one is, again, one of our cheaper microscopes, the Boreal, and it's around sort of the $200–300 range again. And the benefit of this one is you can move it around to be facing the stage how I prefer. And this one, same thing, it faces the stage. The other thing you want to look for, and I think this is pretty standard when you have two eyepieces. I don't recommend the ones that just come as one eyepiece, because that means you have to keep an eye closed all the time, and that can just give you a headache over time. Also, images are sharper when you're using both of your eyes and they're both in focus. But when you are looking at a binocular microscope, you want to make sure that the eyepieces can change in terms of how close they are. And the reason that matters is for people like me, where my eyes are pretty close together, versus some people have eyes that are wider set. So to make sure you're at the middle focus part of your, pupils, you want to have these be able to line up. And you'll be able to tell really quickly when you start using a microscope that both are in line with both of your eyes. I think a lot of people, when they first start using a microscope, tend to use their dominant eye, which for me is my right, and then just sort of like ignore their left eye, or maybe, or closing one eye. But when you get them both in line and they're both in focus, it makes such a difference to the detail that you're seeing with your microscope. So I encourage you to look for ones that can swivel like this. And then when you do, go to use it for the first time, make sure you are focusing on something and practicing using both eyes. Okay, so to wrap this up and talk about which microscope you should choose, I would personally pick this guy, which is an AM scope. And this is the $400 to $500 one. It's very similar to the several $1,000 one we use in the lab, but obviously it's cheaper, and it's pretty indistinguishable in terms of its sturdiness and its clarity. The only time I guess I would pick one of these two cheaper ones that I personally just find a little bit more frustrating to use and a little less clear picture is if you were transporting them a lot, like taking them to different farms, or needed it to be not plugged in sometimes, maybe for demos. And even though we said at the beginning that, a compound scope might be more than you need most of the time, we do have growers buying cheaper versions. So this version is actually, again, only around $400 to $500 versus the compound scope I have in my lab is $5,000. But we, again, find them almost indistinguishable now, or at least for thrips identification, there's not that big a difference. So I do have growers purchasing this now who are struggling with things like thrips parvospinus or thripsitosis, so that they can accurately ID which thrips they have, because to get to the nitty-gritty between some of the thrips species, as we talk about in our thrips workshop, you actually need to look at really fine features where you need a compound scope. So if you are doing a lot of thrips identification on your farm, or maybe mite identification, then absolutely a compound scope and the dissecting scope together for around $1,000, even with an external light source, I think is totally worth it. If you don't have that budget right now, or you think you're going to be using them in the field a lot or transporting them to different sites, then these $200 to $300 ones will serve you well. Either way, I think investing in a microscope is a critical part of running a greenhouse farm these days in terms of both identifying pests, because we're getting a lot more invasive pests than we used to, and quality controlling your biocontrol agents, and even just looking at diseases or nutrient deficiencies under the microscope. And again, these can be really, really valuable to take pictures through, to send to extension agents to help with diagnostics. And really all that comes down to is putting your smartphone up to the lens and fiddling around with it a bit to make sure the fields of view are lining up. They actually do make attachments for microscopes now for your smartphones to sit in. So that might be something else you want to invest in, and they're just like 30 or 40 bucks. So overall, I hope this has been a good introductory lesson to microscopes, and I hope you all enjoy using them in the future. Walk us through this. Walk you through this. This doesn't make any sense. Stay enough to not embarrass me. Why are you flickering? Why? Okay, stop. Just bear with me. We're gonna edit this out. Why do you hate me? They can bend in all the directions like goose necks. Not that I'm experienced with bending gooses. I'm getting silly.